The Abbott family had everything: wealth, influence, and an enviable closeness that outsiders admired. They seemed untouchable. Daniel Abbott, a self-made tech tycoon in his late 50s, was the charismatic patriarch who loved to regale anyone who would listen with stories of how he built his company from scratch. His wife, Caroline, was the picture of elegance and poise, always standing by his side, the perfect partner in life and in appearances. Their son, Michael, had inherited Daniel's sharp mind and charisma. At 33, he was poised to take over the family business. Michael's wife, Emma, was just as stunning as she was smart, a lawyer with a razor-sharp wit who had seamlessly become part of the Abbott inner circle. Together, Michael and Emma represented the future of the Abbott dynasty. But behind the polished smiles and pristine holiday cards, something was quietly unraveling. It began innocently enough, or so it seemed. Daniel and Emma bonded over shared interests during family dinners, often finding themselves the last two at the table, laughing at obscure historical anecdotes or debating current events. Their connection was intellectual at first, a mutual respect born from admiration. Emma had always seen Daniel as a mentor, a guiding force who had achieved the kind of success she aspired to. But there was a flicker in Daniel's eyes whenever he spoke to her, a flicker she didn't notice at first, but one that eventually became impossible to ignore. One evening, during a family celebration for Michael's promotion, Emma stepped outside for air. The party had been overwhelming, and she wanted a moment to herself. She didn't expect Daniel to follow her. "You're a breath of fresh air, Emma," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. There was an intensity in his gaze that made her heart skip, not with attraction, but with confusion. She brushed it off as harmless admiration, but it left her unsettled. What Emma didn't know was that Daniel's feelings were growing. What had started as a harmless admiration had evolved into something darker, something he couldn't admit even to himself. As the evening ended, Emma felt a strange tension in the air. Michael, ever the attentive husband, noticed her distracted expression but chalked it up to exhaustion. "You've been working too hard," he said, wrapping an arm around her. She nodded, leaning into him, but her mind was elsewhere, on that look in Daniel's eyes. What she didn't realize was that this was just the beginning of a chain of events that would shake the foundation of everything the Abbotts held dear. Weeks passed, and the Abbott household buzzed with its usual activities: charity galas, high-stakes business meetings, and Sunday family dinners that brought everyone together under one roof. On the surface, everything was as it had always been. Yet beneath the polished veneer, an imperceptible shift had begun. Emma found herself avoiding Daniel, though she couldn't quite articulate why. His presence, once a source of comfort and guidance, now felt charged with an unspoken energy. She couldn't ignore the way his compliments lingered just a second too long, or how he always seemed to position himself near her during family gatherings. Was she imagining it? She wasn't sure. And that uncertainty gnawed at her. Daniel, meanwhile, was fighting his own internal battle. He was a man used to control, both in his professional life and his personal one. But his growing fixation on Emma was something he couldn't rationalize away. He told himself it was innocent, that his admiration was simply for her intelligence and drive. Yet, late at night, when the house was quiet and his wife slept beside him, his thoughts strayed to Emma in ways he refused to acknowledge. One evening, Michael and Emma hosted a small dinner at their home, a cozy affair with just the immediate family. Emma had prepared the menu herself, wanting everything to be perfect. She wore a simple black dress, understated but elegant, and Daniel couldn't take his eyes off her. His wife, Caroline, noticed but said nothing. She had learned long ago to turn a blind eye to Daniel's wandering attention, confident it was harmless. As the evening unfolded, the conversation flowed easily, with laughter filling the room. But there was a moment, brief, fleeting, that changed everything. Emma, reaching for a glass of wine, accidentally knocked over a candle holder. The flame extinguished instantly, and she let out a small gasp of surprise. Daniel was by her side before anyone else could react. "Are you all right?" he asked, his hand brushing hers as he steadied the table. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through Emma. She looked up at him, and for a split second, their eyes met in a way that neither of them could explain. It wasn't attraction, at least not in any conventional sense, but it was charged, electric, and utterly forbidden. Michael, engrossed in a story Caroline was telling, didn't notice. But Caroline did. Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly as she observed the interaction, filing it away in her mind for later. She had learned to recognize when something wasn't quite right, and this was one of those moments. That night, as Emma lay in bed beside Michael, her thoughts raced. She tried to push the memory of Daniel's touch out of her mind, but it clung to her like a shadow. Was she reading too much into it? Was she overthinking a harmless gesture? She turned to Michael, who was already asleep, his breathing steady and calm. Guilt pricked at her, though she couldn't quite say why. In the guest bedroom down the hall, Daniel stared at the ceiling, his mind replaying that brief moment over and over. He knew it was wrong, but he couldn't help himself. It wasn't love, he knew that much. But it was something powerful, something dangerous, and it terrified him. The next morning, the family gathered for breakfast. Conversation was light and cheerful, but the air was thick with unspoken tension. Caroline watched Daniel and Emma closely, her instincts on high alert. Daniel avoided Emma's gaze, while Emma kept her focus on Michael, trying desperately to pretend everything was normal. But things were far from normal. What had once been an unbreakable family bond was beginning to fray at the edges, and none of them could see the unraveling storm that was about to engulf them all. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Over the next few weeks, she caught Caroline's gaze more than once, sharp and scrutinizing. It wasn't overt, but there was a sense of knowing in her mother-in-law's eyes that made Emma's skin crawl. Was it guilt making her paranoid? She wasn't sure, but the weight of unspoken tension was growing heavier by the day. Daniel, on the other hand, had retreated. He avoided being alone with Emma at all costs, throwing himself into work and finding reasons to leave the room whenever she entered. It was his attempt at control, a futile effort to bury his growing obsession. Yet, the more he tried to suppress it, the more it consumed him. One evening, Emma stayed late at the office, engrossed in a particularly complex case. She was relieved to be away from the Abbott household, away from Daniel's lingering presence and Caroline's piercing eyes. The silence of her office was a welcome reprieve. That is, until her phone buzzed. It was a text from Daniel. "Are you still at the office? I'm nearby. Need to talk." Her stomach twisted. She stared at the message, unsure how to respond. There was nothing inherently inappropriate about his words, yet something about them felt off. After a moment of hesitation, she replied, "Yes, finishing up. What's on your mind?" Daniel arrived 15 minutes later, looking as composed as ever, though Emma noticed the tension in his jaw. He brought 2 cups of coffee, setting one on her desk before taking a seat across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "I've been meaning to thank you," he began, his tone measured, "for everything you've done for this family. Michael's success wouldn't be what it is without your support." Emma shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "You don't have to thank me, Daniel. Michael's worked hard for everything he's achieved." Daniel's gaze softened, and for a fleeting moment, she saw a vulnerability in him she'd never noticed before. "You remind me of myself," he said quietly. "Ambitious, determined. It's admirable." Emma's pulse quickened. She forced a smile, hoping to steer the conversation back to safer territory. "Well, I learned from the best," she said lightly. But Daniel wasn't done. "Emma," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "there's something about you that draws people in. It's not just your intelligence or your beauty. It's—" "Daniel, stop," Emma interrupted, her voice firm but trembling. "This isn't appropriate." Daniel's expression shifted, a mix of regret and something darker. "You're right," he said quickly, standing up. "I shouldn't have come. Forget I said anything." Emma watched him leave, her heart pounding. She felt a mixture of relief and dread, knowing that whatever this was, it wasn't over. She stayed in her office long after he left, replaying the conversation in her mind and questioning how things had spiraled so far out of control. When Emma finally returned home that night, she found Caroline waiting for her in the kitchen. The older woman was sipping a glass of wine, her expression unreadable. "Late night?" Caroline asked casually, though her tone carried an edge. "Yeah, work's been demanding," Emma replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Caroline set her glass down and looked at Emma, her eyes sharper than ever. "Be careful, Emma," she said softly. "The Abbott family has survived many storms. But some storms are harder to weather than others." Emma froze, unsure how to respond. Was it a warning? A threat? She couldn't tell. But one thing was clear: Caroline knew more than she was letting on. As Emma lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she realized that the web of secrets and lies was tightening around her. And somewhere in the shadows, a reckoning was beginning to take shape. The Abbott family gathered at their lakeside vacation home for a weekend retreat, a tradition meant to strengthen their bond. But this year, the serene waters of the lake mirrored a tension that no one could ignore. Emma had barely slept since the conversation with Daniel, and Caroline's cryptic warning echoed in her mind. She felt trapped, as though she were walking a tightrope with no end in sight. The atmosphere during the first evening was deceptively pleasant. Michael grilled steaks on the deck while Caroline prepared her famous peach cobbler in the kitchen. Daniel, ever the charming host, poured wine and regaled the group with anecdotes from his early career. Emma laughed when she was supposed to, but her mind was elsewhere. Later that night, as the family sat around the fire pit, Daniel made a comment that sent a chill through Emma. "Success isn't just about hard work," he said, swirling his wine. "It's about recognizing opportunities when they appear, grabbing them before someone else does." Emma's eyes snapped to his, but he wasn't looking at her. Or was he? The words hung in the air, their meaning ambiguous, yet laced with something that made her skin crawl. Caroline, sitting beside him, glanced at Emma briefly before taking a long sip of her wine. Michael, oblivious, was scrolling through photos on his phone to show everyone. The next morning, Emma woke early, hoping to escape the suffocating atmosphere. She went for a run along the wooded trails behind the house, the crisp morning air offering a temporary reprieve. She thought she was alone until she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Daniel. Her heart sank. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said, his breath misting in the cool air. "I thought a run might clear my head." Emma stopped, her chest tightening. "Daniel, we need to talk," she said, her voice firm but quiet. "This tension between us, it has to stop." Daniel stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "Tension? Emma, I don't know what you're talking about." She blinked, caught off guard by his feigned ignorance. "You know exactly what I mean. You've crossed lines and it's making me uncomfortable?" he interrupted, his tone soft but laced with something unsettling. "Emma, you've misunderstood. I respect you. I admire you. If you've felt anything beyond that, it's not my intention." His words were calculated, yet his eyes betrayed him. Emma felt a surge of frustration and fear. He was manipulating the situation, twisting it to make her doubt herself. "Let's just stay away from each other," she said finally, turning to leave. But Daniel wasn't finished. "You're part of this family, Emma," he called after her. "And family looks out for each other. Remember that." The words sent a shiver down her spine. She didn't respond, jogging away without looking back. When she returned to the house, Caroline was waiting for her on the porch, a cup of coffee in hand. "Rough morning?" Caroline asked, her voice deceptively light. Emma hesitated. "Just needed some air," she replied, avoiding eye contact. Caroline studied her for a moment before leaning in. "You can tell me if something's wrong," she said, her voice low. "I'm good at keeping secrets." Emma's stomach twisted. Was it a genuine offer or a veiled threat? She couldn't tell anymore. The lines between ally and adversary were becoming increasingly blurred. By the time the family sat down for brunch, the tension was palpable. Daniel was his usual charming self, but Emma noticed how carefully he avoided looking at her. Caroline, however, seemed to be watching everyone, her sharp gaze missing nothing. Michael, oblivious as always, was focused on the conversation about work. But just as they were finishing their meal, Caroline dropped her fork with a loud clatter, drawing everyone's attention. "Emma," she said, her tone casual but pointed, "why don't you join me for a walk later? There's something I'd like to discuss." Emma's heart skipped a beat. "Of course," she replied, forcing a smile. As the table cleared, Emma felt the walls closing in. Whatever Caroline wanted to discuss, it was clear that this wasn't a simple walk. And she couldn't shake the feeling that the web of secrets was tightening, and she was the one caught at the center. The afternoon sun was high in the sky as Emma followed Caroline down the winding path that circled the lake. The air was heavy with the scent of pine, and the only sound was the soft crunch of gravel beneath their feet. Emma's nerves were on edge, her mind racing with possibilities. Whatever Caroline wanted to say, it wasn't going to be good. For a while, they walked in silence. Caroline seemed in no rush, her gaze fixed on the path ahead. Finally, she stopped at a small clearing overlooking the water and turned to Emma. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were razor-sharp. "You're not very good at hiding things, Emma," Caroline said, her voice deceptively soft. Emma stiffened. "I'm not sure what you mean." Caroline's lips curled into a faint smile. "Don't insult my intelligence. I see everything, Emma. I've seen the way Daniel looks at you. And I've seen the way you react to him." Emma's heart pounded in her chest. "Nothing has happened," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "I would never." Caroline raised a hand, cutting her off. "Stop. I'm not here to accuse you of anything. But I need you to understand something very clearly. This family is everything to me. I've spent decades building it, protecting it. And I won't let anyone, tear it apart." Emma felt a lump rise in her throat. "I'm not trying to tear anything apart," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Caroline stepped closer, her gaze unrelenting. "Maybe not. But Daniel, he has a way of crossing boundaries when he thinks no one is watching. This isn't the first time I've had to deal with his distractions." Emma's eyes widened. "You've known?" Caroline let out a dry laugh. "Of course I've known. Do you think a man like Daniel can keep secrets from me? But I've learned how to manage him. And now I'm telling you to manage yourself." The words stung, but Emma couldn't deny the truth in them. Caroline wasn't just protecting her family, she was protecting herself. And in doing so, she was drawing a line that Emma couldn't cross. "I don't want any trouble," Emma said finally. "I'll keep my distance." Caroline studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Good. That's all I ask." As they walked back to the house, Emma felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Caroline's warning was clear, but the implications were more complex than she had imagined. How much did Caroline really know? And how far would she go to protect her family? When they returned, Michael was sitting on the deck, flipping through a magazine. He looked up and smiled. "How was the walk?" he asked. "Lovely," Caroline replied smoothly. "Emma and I had a nice chat." Emma forced a smile, but her mind was elsewhere. She could feel Daniel's gaze from inside the house, though she refused to meet it. The walls were closing in, and she couldn't escape the feeling that someone, was about to break. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, the tension was palpable. Caroline was unusually cheerful, playing the perfect hostess. Daniel was quieter than usual, his gaze flickering to Emma only briefly. Michael, oblivious as always, was recounting a story from work, his laughter filling the room. But just as dessert was being served, there was a loud crash from the kitchen. Everyone jumped, and Emma rushed to investigate. She found the source of the noise, a shattered glass on the floor, and Daniel standing nearby, his face pale. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice shaky. "I wasn't paying attention." Emma bent down to pick up the shards, but Daniel stopped her, his hand brushing hers. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through her. She looked up at him, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. "Emma," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Everything all right in here?" Caroline's voice cut through the tension like a knife. She stood in the doorway, her expression calm but her eyes cold. Emma jumped back, her cheeks flushing. "Yes, just a broken glass," she said quickly, avoiding Caroline's gaze. Caroline's eyes flicked between them before she smiled. "Be careful, Daniel," she said lightly. "You wouldn't want to hurt yourself." As she walked away, Emma felt a chill run down her spine. The unspoken truth hung heavy in the air, and she knew that whatever was happening was far from over. When the family ties choke. Part 6. Fault lines exposed. The Abbott family returned to their respective routines, but the cracks beneath the surface had deepened. Emma tried to throw herself into her work, hoping to distract herself from the tension, but her thoughts constantly drifted back to the events at the lake house. Caroline's warning, Daniel's growing fixation, and her own uneasy role in this tangled web haunted her every step. Meanwhile, Daniel's behavior grew increasingly erratic. At the office, he was distracted, short-tempered, and prone to long silences. His employees whispered about the change in him, wondering if the weight of running the company was finally catching up. But those closest to him knew better. Caroline, ever the keen observer, had begun taking subtle steps to tighten her control. She attended more board meetings, made polite inquiries about Daniel's schedule, and made sure she was always within earshot when he and Emma were in the same room. It was a quiet but calculated strategy to assert her dominance, a reminder to Daniel and Emma alike that she was watching. One evening, as Emma was wrapping up a late night at the office, she received a text from Michael. "Running late. Dinner's in the oven. Love you." She smiled at the message, grateful for his steady presence. But just as she was packing up her things, another text came through, this time from Daniel. "We need to talk. Come to my office. Now." Her stomach dropped. She hesitated, considering ignoring it, but the thought of leaving things unresolved filled her with dread. With a deep breath, she headed to his office. When she arrived, Daniel was pacing behind his desk, his face drawn and tired. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment, they simply stared at each other. The air between them was heavy, charged with unspoken tension. "What's this about?" Emma asked, keeping her voice steady. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his usual composure slipping. I can't stop thinking about you, Emma. It's driving me mad." Emma's heart raced. "Daniel, we've talked about this. It has to stop. For everyone's sake." "I know," he said, his voice strained. "But I don't know how to stop. You're in my head, Emma. All the time." She shook her head, her voice rising in frustration. "Do you hear yourself? This isn't just about you, Daniel. There's Michael, Caroline, this entire family. You're putting everything at risk." Daniel stepped closer, his expression desperate. "I don't want to hurt anyone. I can't pretend this doesn't exist." Emma took a step back, her pulse pounding in her ears. "This ends now. Whatever this is, it ends." Before Daniel could respond, the door to his office opened, and Caroline stepped in. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were sharp, taking in the scene with unnerving precision. "Am I interrupting?" she asked, her voice icy. Emma froze, her mind racing. "We were just talking business," Daniel cut in, his voice regaining its usual calm. "Emma had some ideas for the new project." Caroline's lips curved into a faint smile. "How productive of you both." She paused, her gaze lingering on Emma. "Though I do hope you're not overstepping, dear. Some boundaries are better left intact." Emma felt her cheeks flush. "Of course. I was just leaving." She hurried past Caroline, her heart pounding as she made her way to the elevator. The ride down felt like an eternity, and when she finally stepped out into the cool night air, she felt as though she could finally breathe again. Back in Daniel's office, Caroline closed the door behind her and turned to face him. Her smile was gone, replaced by a cold, steely gaze. Do you think I'm blind, Daniel? She asked, her voice low. Do you think I don't see what's happening? Daniel sighed, running a hand over his face. Caroline, Stop, she snapped, cutting him off. You're jeopardizing everything. This family, this company, our reputation. Do you even understand what's at stake? He looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. I'm trying to fix it. Caroline's laugh was bitter. You're trying to fix it by dragging her into your mess? You'll ruin her, Daniel. And I won't let that happen. What do you want me to do? He asked, his voice tired. Caroline stepped closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. You end this. Now. Or I will. As she left the office, Daniel sank into his chair, the gravity of the situation pressing down on him. He knew Caroline meant every word, and for the first time, he felt the walls closing in around him. The tension between Emma and Daniel lingered like a storm cloud, unseen but always present. Caroline, however, had moved from observation to action. She wasn't a woman who relied on idle threats. For decades, she had maneuvered through Daniel's indiscretions and business rivals alike, always ensuring her family remained intact. This time, she knew, was different. Emma wasn't like the others. She was embedded in the Abbott dynasty, a threat not only to Caroline's marriage but to the very foundation of the family's legacy. Caroline began her quiet campaign. It started with subtle remarks at family dinners. Emma, you've been looking so tired lately, she said one evening, her tone filled with mock concern. I hope the pressure of balancing everything isn't becoming too much. Emma, caught off guard, forced a polite smile. Just a busy few weeks, that's all. Caroline's smile didn't reach her eyes. Perhaps you should take some time off. Focus on your marriage. Michael needs a wife who's present, wouldn't you agree? Emma's cheeks burned, but she said nothing, sensing the trap Caroline was laying. Michael, blissfully unaware, simply nodded along, agreeing that some time away might be good for them both. But Caroline wasn't satisfied with veiled barbs. Behind the scenes, she began to undermine Emma in more direct ways. A few well-placed comments to Daniel's closest advisors planted seeds of doubt about Emma's influence within the family business. Rumors began to circulate, nothing overt, just whispers about her intentions, her closeness to Daniel, her loyalty to Michael. It wasn't long before Emma noticed the cold stares from colleagues, the sudden end of conversations as she entered a room. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she was being cornered. Every attempt to confront Daniel about the situation was met with avoidance or vague reassurances. He had grown increasingly distant, retreating into himself as the weight of his desires and the consequences of his actions threatened to crush him. And then came the photographs. One evening, as Emma was leaving the office late, she found an envelope on her car's windshield. There was no note, no explanation, just a series of grainy photos. One was of her and Daniel during the walk at the lake house, standing too close. Another captured the moment he had brushed her hand in the kitchen. The angles were suggestive, the context damning. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the images. Whoever had taken these had been watching, waiting for the perfect moments to twist the narrative. And she knew exactly who was behind it. When Emma arrived home, she found Caroline waiting in the living room, sipping tea as though nothing was amiss. Michael was still at the office, leaving the two women alone. You got my little package, I assume, Caroline said calmly, not even looking up from her cup. Emma dropped the envelope onto the coffee table. What are you trying to prove? She asked, her voice shaking. Caroline set down her tea and looked at Emma with cold precision. I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm protecting my family. You've put yourself in a position you shouldn't be in, Emma. This isn't your game to play. Nothing happened between Daniel and me, Emma said, her voice rising. You're twisting things to fit your narrative. Caroline's expression didn't waver. Perception, my dear, is everything. It doesn't matter what did or didn't happen. What matters is what people believe. Emma stared at her, feeling a surge of anger and helplessness. You're willing to destroy me over something that isn't even real. Caroline leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. If it keeps this family intact, then yes. I'll do whatever it takes. Consider this your warning, Emma. Leave no room for doubt, or I will make sure there's nothing left of you." As Caroline stood and left the room, Emma sat frozen, the weight of the threat pressing down on her. She wasn't just fighting for her place in the Abbott family anymore, she was fighting for her very survival. But Emma wasn't ready to back down. For the first time, she realized that the only way out of this web of lies and manipulation was to play the game on her own terms. And if Caroline thought she could break her so easily, she was in for a surprise. Emma sat in her office, staring at the photographs spread across her desk. Caroline's warning echoed in her mind, but the fear that had gripped her the night before had transformed into something sharper, more resolute. If Caroline wanted a fight, she'd get one. Emma wasn't a stranger to high-stakes situations. She had built her legal career on dismantling lies and uncovering truths. Now, it was time to use those skills for herself. Her first move was quiet but calculated. She began combing through old Abbott family files, business records, press clippings, even internal company memos. Caroline might have been ruthless, but Emma knew no one was invincible. If there was a crack in Caroline's carefully constructed image, Emma would find it. That evening, she returned home earlier than usual, acting as though nothing was amiss. Caroline greeted her with the same cool indifference, Michael with his usual warm smile. Emma played the part of the dutiful wife, even offering to help Caroline with dinner. The two women moved around the kitchen in a tense silence, the unspoken battle between them palpable. "I was thinking," Emma said casually as she sliced vegetables, "maybe Michael and I should take that trip you suggested. A little time away could do us good." Caroline raised an eyebrow but said nothing for a moment. "That's a wonderful idea," she replied smoothly. "Sometimes distance provides clarity." Emma smiled, masking the bitterness that bubbled beneath the surface. "I'll start looking at destinations tomorrow." The exchange seemed innocent enough, but it was Emma's first play. She wanted Caroline to believe she was backing down, retreating from the fight. Meanwhile, her real plan was already in motion. The next day, Emma scheduled a meeting with a private investigator. She handed over the photographs and explained her suspicions. "I need to know who took these," she said, her voice firm. "And I need leverage." The investigator, a grizzled man named Roy with decades of experience, nodded. "You're not the first to come to me with an Abbott problem," he said, jotting notes. "They've got a lot of skeletons in their closets." Emma leaned forward. "Then find me the one that will make them think twice before coming after me." While Roy worked in the shadows, Emma began subtly testing the waters at home. She started asking Michael more about the family business, feigning curiosity, but secretly fishing for details about Caroline's role. She also paid closer attention to Daniel, watching for any sign that he might crack under the pressure. Daniel, for his part, was unraveling. Caroline's intervention had rattled him, and Emma's sudden coldness only deepened his confusion. He began drinking more, often retreating to his study late at night. One evening, Emma found him there, slumped over his desk, a glass of whiskey in hand. "Daniel," she said softly, stepping into the room. "You can't keep doing this to yourself." He looked up at her, his eyes bloodshot. "I've ruined everything, haven't I?" he muttered. "Michael, Caroline, you..." Emma hesitated, torn between pity and anger. "You can fix it," she said carefully. "But you have to stop running from it." Daniel stared at her for a long moment before nodding, though she wasn't sure he truly believed her. As she left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was a ticking time bomb, and that when he exploded, the fallout would be catastrophic. A few days later, Roy called with an update. "You were right to suspect Caroline," he said. "Those photos? Taken by someone on her payroll. But that's not the interesting part." Emma gripped the phone tightly. "What is?" "I dug deeper, like you asked. Caroline's been quietly funneling money into a separate account. Big money. Offshore." Emma's heart raced. "What for?" "Hard to say without more digging, but my guess? She's hedging her bets. Preparing for a worst-case scenario." Emma's mind spun. Caroline wasn't just trying to protect the family, she was protecting herself. Whatever she was hiding, it was big enough to risk everything for. And if Emma could uncover it, she might finally have the upper hand. As she hung up the phone, Emma felt the first glimmer of hope she'd had in weeks. The war between her and Caroline was far from over, but for the first time, she had a weapon of her own. And she wasn't afraid to use it. Emma sat in her car outside the Abbott estate, staring at the file Roy had delivered. It was a Pandora's box of secrets, offshore accounts, questionable business deals, and transactions that pointed to a hidden life Caroline had carefully concealed. The money transfers weren't just large, they were monumental, implicating not just Caroline but potentially Daniel and the entire Abbott legacy. Emma took a deep breath and closed the folder. She had what she needed. The question now was how to use it without burning herself in the process. Caroline had built her life around control, but this file could shatter that control in an instant. Still, Emma knew Caroline wouldn't go down without a fight. That evening, Emma waited until Michael was deep in conversation with Daniel about a new business venture before quietly making her way to the study. Caroline was there, as Emma had expected, sipping a glass of wine and scrolling through her tablet. "You're bold, I'll give you that," Emma said as she stepped inside, her voice low but firm. Caroline looked up, her expression unreadable. "Emma, dear. What a surprise. To what do I owe this visit?" Emma set the file down on the desk, sliding it toward Caroline. "This. Your hidden accounts, the money you've been siphoning, the offshore transfers. Care to explain?" For the first time, Emma saw something flicker in Caroline's eyes, shock, quickly masked by her usual composure. "You've been busy," Caroline said, her tone icy. "You came after me first," Emma shot back. "I'm just returning the favor." Caroline leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady. "And what exactly do you plan to do with this information? Threaten me? Blackmail me? Don't forget who you're dealing with, Emma. I've spent decades protecting this family. Do you think I'm afraid of a file?" Emma stepped closer, her voice calm but unwavering. "I don't want to destroy this family, Caroline. But I won't let you destroy me either. You've made your point, you've warned me, you've tried to isolate me, and you've twisted the narrative to make me the villain. But if you push me any further, I'll take this public. And we both know what that will do to the Abbotts." Caroline's jaw tightened, her mask slipping for the briefest moment. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she said quietly. "But you're playing a dangerous game, Emma." "I'm not playing," Emma said firmly. "I'm done letting you control me. This ends now." For a moment, neither woman spoke. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the heater. Finally, Caroline let out a bitter laugh. "You've got spirit, I'll give you that. But let me tell you something, Emma, power isn't about files or threats. It's about endurance. And I've endured far worse than you." Emma held her ground. "Maybe. But even you have limits, Caroline. And this file is proof of yours." Caroline's expression hardened, but she didn't respond. Instead, she stood, taking the file and tucking it under her arm. "If you think this changes anything, you're mistaken. But I'll give you credit, you've surprised me." As she walked past Emma, she paused in the doorway. "Be careful, dear. You may think you've won this round, but the game isn't over." Emma waited until Caroline was gone before letting out a shaky breath. She knew this was far from the end. If anything, she had just escalated the stakes. But for the first time, she felt like she had some semblance of control. What Emma didn't know was that Caroline wasn't retreating, she was regrouping. And in the shadows, another player was about to emerge, one who would tip the balance in ways no one could predict. The Abbott estate was unusually quiet that evening, the kind of stillness that hinted at an impending storm. Emma stayed in her room, running over her confrontation with Caroline again and again. She had expected retaliation. Caroline wasn't the type to let something like this go. What Emma hadn't anticipated was how far the retaliation would go, or who would be caught in the crossfire. The first crack came in the form of a family dinner that Daniel had hastily arranged, claiming it was time to Clear the air. Emma was on edge, but Michael, always the optimist, assumed it was just a chance to reconnect. Caroline, as poised as ever, agreed with a serene smile that made Emma's stomach churn. The table was set, the wine poured, and everyone took their seats. Daniel began with an anecdote about a business deal from years ago, his voice steady but lacking its usual warmth. Emma couldn't focus on his words. She was too busy watching Caroline, who seemed unusually calm, almost detached. But it wasn't Caroline who made the first move. Halfway through dinner, Daniel put down his fork and cleared his throat. "There's something we need to discuss," he said, his eyes flicking to Emma. "Something that's been weighing on me." Emma froze. Caroline's expression didn't change, but her grip on her wineglass tightened ever so slightly. "I've made mistakes," Daniel continued, his voice heavy. "I've let my feelings cloud my judgment." Michael looked up, confused. "What are you talking about, Dad?" Daniel hesitated, then looked directly at Emma. "I've developed feelings for Emma. It was inappropriate, and I take full responsibility. But nothing happened, nothing ever happened." The words hit the table like a bomb. Michael stared at his father, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to process what he'd just heard. "What the hell are you saying?" Emma's heart pounded. "Michael, he's telling the truth. Nothing happened. I swear." But Michael wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed on Daniel, blazing with betrayal. "You had feelings for my wife? Are you kidding me?" Caroline finally spoke, her voice calm but cold. "Michael, lower your voice. Let's not turn this into a spectacle." "A spectacle?" Michael snapped, his voice rising. "My father just admitted he has feelings for Emma, and you're worried about appearances." Daniel tried to speak, but Michael cut him off. "You're pathetic," he said, his voice shaking. "You've always been obsessed with control, with getting what you want. But this is beyond disgusting." Emma reached for Michael's hand, but he pulled away, standing abruptly. "I can't do this," he said, storming out of the dining room. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma sat frozen, her mind racing. Caroline, however, seemed unfazed. She set down her glass and turned to Daniel. "You've made a mess of things," she said quietly. "But at least now it's out in the open." Daniel stared at her, his composure crumbling. "I thought telling the truth would fix things." Caroline's laugh was sharp and bitter. "The truth? Oh, Daniel, you don't even know the meaning of the word." Before anyone could respond, Caroline stood and addressed Emma directly. "You think you're clever, don't you? Digging up my accounts, coming at me with your threats. But you don't know the half of it." Emma's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" Caroline smiled, a predator's smile. "Do you really think Daniel is the only one who's been keeping secrets? Michael isn't as innocent as you think." Emma blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" Caroline's gaze turned razor-sharp. "Michael's been having an affair." The words hit Emma like a slap. She shook her head, unwilling to believe it. "You're lying." Caroline pulled out her phone, tapping the screen a few times before sliding it across the table. On it were photos, grainy but unmistakable, of Michael in the arms of another woman. The timestamps on the photos were recent, far too recent for Emma to brush off as something from the past. "No," Emma whispered, her voice cracking. "This can't be real." Caroline tilted her head. "Believe what you want, dear. But if you think you're the only one who's been betrayed, think again." Daniel stood abruptly, his face pale. "Caroline, that's enough." "Oh, don't act so noble," Caroline snapped. "This family has been rotting from the inside for years, and you're as much to blame as anyone." Emma stood, her legs shaking. "You've all lied to me," she said, her voice rising. "All of you." Before anyone could respond, Emma turned and walked out, the weight of everything crashing down on her. The perfect Abbott family was a lie, a façade held together by secrets, manipulation, and betrayal. As she drove away from the estate, Emma realized something else. She was finally free. Free from the lies, free from the control, free from a family that had only ever sought to use her. And for the first time in weeks, she felt a strange sense of relief. But as she disappeared into the night, one thought lingered in her mind. If the Abbotts were willing to go to such lengths to protect their secrets, how far would they go to silence her now that she knew the truth?